Welcome to Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. Today we talk to author Helen Andrews about the baby boomers and how they not only arguably made everything worse, they maddeningly refused to admit it. Well, let's go. Givers, Doers, and Thinkers introduces listeners to the fascinating people and important ideas at the heart of American civil society. We speak with philanthropists, nonprofit leaders, social entrepreneurs, historians, journalists, and anyone else who will help us understand contemporary civil society's achievements and failures. We also sprinkle in practical advice for nonprofit leaders and fundraisers. My name is Jeremy Beer, and thanks for joining us. All right. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Givers, Doers, and Thinkers. We are very glad to have with us today Helen Andrews, print editor at the American Conservative, on whose parent nonprofit, I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, I serve as chairman of the board. Helen is a rising critic, essayist, and most recently author of Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster, published just last month, which would be January 2021, and to great acclaim. Helen took a degree in religious studies at Yale before going on to work at the Washington Examiner, National Review, and the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, First Things, the Hedgehog Review, and elsewhere. Boomers will be the subject of our discussion with her today. It's already, as I say, we're talking to Helen on February 8th, 2021, already received positive attention, even from the New Yorker, which is not an easy thing to get when you're writing from a perspective like Helen's. You certainly don't have to agree with all of her judgments. That would be impossible, I'll tell you right now, for there are many, and they are most definitely the product of her own critical intelligence. To think that Boomers is a brilliant book, I unreservedly recommend it to your attention. And so I am very happy to have Helen here today. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you so much, Jeremy.
It is great to speak with you about this book. Let's start with the genesis of it and why you chose to write it. I know that you tell the story in the book that your editor at First Things, Rusty Reno, recommended you take on this topic, in part because you're mean. That's what you write in the book.
I claim on Rusty's part that I dispute, by the way.
Yes. No, I don't think you're mean, but you do have a sharp critical intelligence, I would say. And that comes out in the book. But another motivation I know stems in large part from sort of your millennials' sense of disinheritance, what you call in the book, and I'll quote you here, the most dramatic sundering of Western civilization since the Protestant Reformation. So as a way of sort of orienting listeners to your thesis, perhaps you could start by just telling us a little bit about that sense of disinheritance or sundering and what that primarily consists of.
It started off as a metaphorical sense of being disinherited. As a millennial growing up, I felt I could feel my mind filling up with the kind of knowledge that I was being taught in public school and with lots of pop culture ephemera. And I gradually realized that I was not receiving a lot of the civilizational inheritance that would have been considered standard in any previous era. I was not receiving any kind of religious instruction or instruction in the great Western tradition. And this void became very galling to me. And I spent the first 20 years of my life trying to figure out what had gone wrong. And then I graduated from college in 2008 into the teeth of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. And that sense of being disinherited got a lot more literal really fast.
Agreed. Yes.
Because that was definitely a moment when the millennials found themselves swimming in very deep water. But a lot of the response to it was still dominated by a politics where boomers and their interests are the most important thing. So it was in the course of trying to figure out what had gone wrong and why the millennials all seemed so alienated and adrift that I decided to trace back the genesis of all of these flaws and problems. And every time I pulled on a string, it ended up leading me back to the baby boomer generation. So that was the reason why I decided to tie all the strings together in a book about them.
Arguably, every generation enters into some kind of argument or dispute with the generations preceding it. So what's different about the boomers? I presume your argument is that they're disinheriting those who came after them from the tradition in which they were themselves brought up is very, very different qualitatively from anything that happened before.
That's right. There's an expression sometimes attributed, I think, to Lenin or Marx or one of those old communists, that there are years when nothing happens and then weeks where centuries happen. History does not proceed at a regular pace. Sometimes a whole lot happens really quickly. And the baby boomers are a generation like that. They are a generation that changed the world to a pretty massive extent in a way that most generations don't. A book that mine was modeled on is Lytton Strachey's Eminent Victorians, which came out in 1918. And the Victorians are another example of a generation that just had a really big impact. And in the case of the baby boomers, the reason why was that there are so many of them. I mean, that's why they have that name. They're demographically a baby boom, which has meant that unlike most generations who, make a big splash in their youth and then gradually attain positions of power and then fade from the scene as they begin to age, the baby boomers made a huge splash in the 1960s and have not left the stage since. They have continued to be the most massive demographic factor in American culture, which has meant that they have an outsized influence in politics and music and movies and everything across the board. So just by sheer longevity and clinging to power for so long, the baby boomers have been a really impactful generation. And then in addition, they also, were really ambitious. They were an exceptionally idealistic generation. And so they set out to accomplish big things and change the world. And they did that too. So that's a lot of reasons why the baby boomers, more than most generations, are worth studying.
How did where did that self-confidence, that preening self-confidence, we might say, come from? How did they become so absolutely convinced in the justice of their causes and the rightness of their views? That seems unusual too. Is that just related to their demographic, the size of the demographic, or is
it mostly is? I get a lot of people pushing back against my thesis by saying, well, yes, the baby boomers are awful, but they're only that way because their parents raised them badly. Blame it all on Dr. Spock. And I understand the impulse on the boomers' part to deflect blame. And certainly as someone who's a millennial writing a book about the boomers, I can't categorically reject the urge to blame things on one's parents. But in the case of the baby boomers, I don't think it's their narcissism comes from anything more complicated than their huge demographic heft. And they probably didn't realize it at the time. They probably thought when they were teenagers in the 1950s and 60s that the reason why teeny bopper stars were covered in all the newspapers and products and advertisements were all aimed at the teenage market was because they were just so awesome. And that was the natural order of things. They didn't realize that the reason why America was obsessed with teenagers in the 50s and 60s is because they were the hugest demographic group. They are narcissists as a result of their huge demographic importance.
Although your answer is also getting at another factor that's sort of conjoined with that one, maybe another thing that needed to be there in order for that demographic to have the impact that it has culturally. I mean, that would be, I'm thinking about your discussion of Richard Hogarth in the book and sort of the technology of mass culture being available to cater to the boomers' market and their whims and needs. Can you talk about that? The sort of how their moment conjoining with the TV, for instance, you talk about in that part of the book, made for an especially large impact on the world.
One of my main grievances against the boomers is their obsession with pop culture, which has replaced in many ways the cultural inheritance that I expected and wanted to be passed down to my generation. Instead of getting the great Western classics, we are, everyone my age has an encyclopedic knowledge of the back catalog of the Beatles and Monty Python and, TV and pop music. And you're right that is in many ways connected to technological developments. The nationalization of culture is something that happened post World War II. All of the distinctive local subcultures, which used to dominate things like radio or live music, which would be the way most people consumed their music, just got kind of suffocated because the national music industry started looming so large. It's similar in some ways to the other big factor in the 1950s and 60s that made the boomers so narcissistic and self-centered. Factor one is their demographic heft. Factor two is, as you say, technological changes in the way culture is consumed. And factor three is prosperity. America was just a much richer country in those decades than at any other point in the 20th century. And so there were, consumerism was at its height, and there were more people trying to sell things to more customers than at any other point in American history. And so that big mad rush to get a piece of America's golden post-war prosperity made advertising and just culture, there were a lot of dollars flowing around. And that also made the boomers sense that, people trying to flatter them into giving up their money was the natural order of things.
Well, this is a big part of your story, is that there was more capital than ever at the time the boomers came of age, and not just financial capital, but maybe in certain ways social and cultural capital. And their legacy seems to have been to not only consume a huge portion of that capital, but without replacing it, but even thinking it needs to be replaced. Is that a good way to put that?
That's right. They had no memory of what life was like before the golden age when they arrived. So they had no memory of poverty. They had no memory of social discontent. So they thought that resilience and stability was just the way that things are. One of the mental exercises that I put myself through in trying to figure out how to structure this book was to imagine myself as a time traveler. If someone had fallen asleep in 1947 and then woken up in 2019, what changes would have struck them? What would they have thought was strange or weird? And it's not going to be things like iPhones. People who, a Rip Van Winkle who fell asleep in the 40s would assume that technology would continue to advance, and he would expect things like self-driving cars or whatever. But the fact that everybody has credit cards and that nobody uses cash anymore, that would be something striking. He would notice things like that. The absence of, the disappearance of the Rotarians and those kinds of civil society institutions that used to be such a huge part of just the day-to-day life of your average suburb dweller have completely vanished. So it's things like that I think would strike the time traveler, but which the boomers kind of didn't notice as they disappeared because they figured they were superfluous or not vital and crucial.
What is the distinctive boomer contribution to that sort of the disappearance of those Rotarian-like groups, fraternal groups, intermediary associations? Is this just a product of their individualistic worldview, or is there something else going on with that?
In a lot of ways, it is just their individualism, but it might also be their own toxic effect on organizations in general. I'm thinking of the churches, which have been run by boomers the way every other institution in America has been for the last several decades. And when you look at the churches that are in trouble, especially the Protestant mainline ones that are way off on the left wing fringe, they're just in a death spiral right now, which is another thing that would completely shock an America, right. An American from 1947. That there are no more Protestants on the Supreme Court, that some of the Protestant churches are moribund and near death. That would seem insane in a country like America, which is supposed to be the capital of these denominations. But one of the reasons why they're so weak is that the things that the boomers did to change these churches when they were in charge of them, with the intention of making them more appealing, had actually the total opposite effect and made people think, well, if church is just going to be liberalism light, why would I even need to go? Why would I care? I could just have the Church of the Democratic Party and I don't have to wake up early on Sundays. So when boomers take things over and reshape institutions in their own image, very frequently the effect of that is to render these institutions pointless and weak and shedding members left and right.
Well, as you point out, they don't even, the characteristic boomer standpoint toward institutions is not really to understand what institutions are for in the first place. Or to, maybe it's a better way to put that would be to say that they don't, institutions, we should be suspicious of their legitimacy, from the get-go. I think you write at one point that loyalty, to institutions is something that would be not only is not considered a virtue anymore, but it's considered a vice, right? It's just sort of being a sucker. And that the result is that, I'm going to quote you here again on the chapter on the millennials. It's today's young people don't belong to anything, never have, and never expect to. Growing up in the world the boomers made, millennials have gotten used to an America denuded of institutions. That's a remarkable statement. Not the America being denuded of institutions, which is remarkable on its own, but that today's young people don't belong to anything and don't expect to belong to anything. That's a different world, very different world.
It absolutely is, and I'm so pleased. I just saw that Yuval Levin's book, A Time to Build, was just awarded ISI's Conservative Book of the Year prize for the last year. And that's a terrific book and one that was a great inspiration to me in thinking through the passage that you just read. Yuval's thesis is that nowadays people have lost the habit of institutional thinking. When people join a workplace or any kind of organization, they only ask themselves, how can this institution serve me? He calls it the platform mentality. How can I make this institution a platform for my personal brand? We have no sense of, shaping your own personality and values and behavior to conform to the institution. And the point of an institution is to, in many ways, build better people, have people stretch themselves and make themselves better. You see these, or as I was writing the book, I witnessed a lot of these cancel culture eruptions at places like the New York Times, where some reporter would say something and all of their colleagues and coworkers would dogpile on them and say, to management, you need to fire this guy because he made some un-PC error. And apart from the merits of these PC attacks, I kept thinking, this is not how you treat a coworker. This is not how you treat an institution where you work. You don't air your dirty laundry all in front of everybody. And I think millennials, who are the perpetrators of a lot of these social media dogpiles, are that way because the boomers have taught them that institutions per se are bad and do nothing but limit individual liberty.
Yeah, because their entire story is about how they themselves overcame and changed unjust institutions, right? I mean, that's just so embedded in their identities.
It's the thing that they're proudest of. And that was something that I tried to do with this book, to tell the boomers that some of the things that they think of as their greatest achievements, these liberationist waves of we have destroyed all the old repressive ideologies of yesteryear, might actually not be achievements at all.
Well, we will be right back with Helen after the break, talk about the boomers, civil society, and philanthropy. And also going to ask you, Helen, about this difference between the transformational and transactional leadership. We'll be right back with Helen Andrews, author of Boomers. Okay, hey, we're back. A little practical interlude here, as we always do on these episodes. Happy to have Mallory Staley joining us today. How you doing, Mallory?
I'm great, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
It is a pleasure to speak with you. Mallory is a senior consultant here at American Philanthropic and has done a lot of work with our clients on foundations, charitable foundations, in terms of coaching them through and then helping them solicit through proposals and applications and all that sort of thing, solicit foundations and manage foundation programs. Mallory, we often start working with clients who don't have much of a foundation program. They've maybe reached out to, they reached out to 6 foundations in 2016. They never heard back from any of them. So, they don't bother with it anymore. Or they have 2 or 3 and they think that's probably all there are out there in the world who might give them money. But we know it doesn't have to be that way, right? But how does it work? How do you manage and run a successful foundations program?
So, Jeremy, the first thing to keep in mind with a foundations program, especially if you're trying to start a new program or revamp an old program that was lost, is that it takes about 12 to 18 months to have a successful foundations program. And for that reason, it makes a lot of sense to make somewhat of a plan, right? So what we tell clients to do is to identify foundations that are aligned with their programs. And sometimes it's not always super clear, but the best way to do that through research is to find foundations that are giving to groups that are similar to yours, right? So, and then identify, if there's a geographic focus for that foundation or something that you might be aligned with. So we usually have clients identify a prospect list and then begin reaching out to that prospect list. And that's mainly done through mailed letters of inquiry. And we know that the foundation...
Mail.
Yes, that's right. And most foundations, they don't have a formal application process that they put out there. They check that little box on their IRS Form 990 that says that they do not accept unsolicited requests. But we know that a mailed letter of inquiry is still okay. So that's the first approach that most groups need to take.
Mallory, okay, that's, by the way, you said something very important, which was it takes a while, right? Like you said, 12 to 18 months. So this is not something that pays off right away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so you really have to be diligent and trust the process before you really see gifts coming in the door.
Yeah. So okay, so you mail a letter of inquiry. What comes next, or what else do you do to get foundations interested in what you're doing?
Well, Jeremy, this is the most important part, and the thing that groups forget to do more than anything is to follow up. Just like if you stumbled across your dream job and you sent in your resume, would you just wait until they reach out to you? No, if it was your dream job, you would follow up and make sure that they're bringing your resume to the top of the stack. And it's the same with foundations. They are getting mailed materials, letters of inquiry, whatever it is, all the time. And you really need to follow up to make sure that 1, your letter was received, but 2, that someone actually read it. And a lot of times they will tell you that they did not receive the letter for whatever reason. So the follow-up process is almost more important than mailing the letter itself.
That's great. Okay, what else?
So once you do that follow-up, and mind you, it can take a while, right? So for the average foundation, you're going to need to follow up about 3 to 4 times until you actually reach another human. And groups, oftentimes, they just want to send emails, or the follow-up process just, gets backburnered for whatever reason. Making cold calls is not really fun for anybody, but I find that is much better to pick up the phone and call than it is to email. And a lot of times, the best part about picking up the phone is that you may find something out from the person on the other end of the phone that you would never have discovered from the 990 or the website. That person may tell you when the board is meeting next. They may give you an email address to send your letter directly to because you mailed it to the wrong address or whatever it is. So foundation follow-up process is really key, 3 to 4 times per foundation. And then the next thing that's the most important, especially if you do get a first-time gift from a foundation, is to cultivate that foundation. We often like to think of foundations like they're this mysterious group, behind closed doors and you can't reach them. But the reality is, and we say it all the time, is that foundations are people too. People give to people. And so if you, however you treat your individual donors, you should treat your foundations exactly the same. cultivate them, stay in touch with them, make sure that they know that you're using their gift to advance your mission, and celebrate your successes with them, whether that's an annual meeting, which is obviously ideal, or just quarterly check-ins by email or phone.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think people definitely don't seem to have internalized oftentimes that you just treat the foundation just like you would another major donor, like a friend or someone that you at least want to give the opportunity for friendship. Mallory, thank you very much. That's good stuff.
Absolutely. Take care, Jeremy.
Take care. All right, we are back with Helen Andrews, author of Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. Wonderful book. So Helen, we're just talking about institutions and the erosion of institutions, the inevitable outcome of Boomers' worldview about institutions. It seems to me it's also inevitable because of something else you write about. And here we can maybe get into the book a little bit more. This difference between transformational and transactional styles of leadership. Can you talk about what you meant by that, and maybe even bring in one of the characters from your book in Al Sharpton?
That is the framework that I use for the chapter on Al Sharpton, because Al Sharpton, in 2 of his autobiographies, has said that that this is the way that he approaches his own style of leadership. He says there are 2 kinds of leaders in the world. There are transformational leaders, and those are people like Dr. King, who change the way people think, who effect mental revolutions in the culture. And then there are transactional leaders, and they are a lot more humble and concrete, and what they want to do is cut deals and make compromises. And the foil that I set up to represent the transactional style is Mayor Daley of Chicago, the first Mayor Daley, and the machine bosses in general. These were the least ideological people in the world. One of the old leaders of Tammany Hall in New York City once gave a speech on Mother's Day where he said, "There is no Mother's Day behind the Iron Curtain." And Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of the great scholarly students of machine politics, said that that was the closest anyone in Tammany Hall had ever come to enunciating an ideology. These were not ideological people. They just wanted to dole out resources and make sure that they were apportioned fairly and negotiate between competing groups and competing interests. And if you can sum up the baby boomers' approach to politics, it would be that they think transformational leadership is the only worthwhile kind. All of their heroes are transformational style leaders. And they think that transactional leaders are, they're cutting deals with racists and reactionaries, and clearly they're compromisers. They're selling out. They're making deals with evil people, and that's bad. But what that means is that we've lost the ability to compromise with each other when our values are in conflict. And that makes it really hard for people who believe different things to just kind of live with each other. And so Al Sharpton is somebody who's kind of filled in the cracks left by our obsession with transformational leadership at the expense of the transactional kind. Because you still need somebody who's willing and able to cut deals, even if your whole ideology says that cutting deals is bad and a waste of time. Somebody's got to go in and do it. And that's the niche that Al Sharpton fills.
Hey, there really is when you start to connect the dots, if the only sort of style of leadership that is legitimate is transformational, then you definitely have an all or nothing sort of style of politics in front of you. And it clearly can't work in a pluralistic society, or at least will cause all sorts of conflict and resentments and the kind of cancel culture we have in front of us today.
And one of the results of that revolution or the disappearance of transactional leadership is an elevation of the law, because judicial imperialism and submitting every single political question to ultimate adjudication, not by Congress, but by the Supreme Court, is a product of that mentality, saying that there's only one right answer. Reason will tell us what the correct solution to any kind of conflict over values is. And so we should be fine. It makes total sense for us to submit it to 9 really smart people with advanced Ivy League degrees, and they will tell us what the answer is. There's no need for complex negotiation of the kind that you would get in the legislative branch. So, one of the big political revolutions of the boomers has been judicial activism, the Warren Court and its aftermath. And that's a side effect of the same transformational versus transactional dichotomy that Al Sharpton represents.
It strikes me that the virtue that is missing here, and again, that would not be perhaps admitted to be a virtue, is humility, epistemic humility. For a while, we were talking about epistemic humility there a few years ago. That was a key. That's if you were a cool kid online and you were trying to turn down the temperature on some of these things, you talked about epistemic humility. But that's again, if you're a transformational leader, you can't be sort of tentative about what it is you're intending to transform and why. You have to. There can be no humility in play. If you're, judicial activism is, of course, inherently antithetical to humility.
The final chapter of the book is about Sonia Sotomayor, and it's because she represents exactly the phenomenon that you're talking about. As I was thinking through the story of judicial activism in American history in the 20th century, I kind of went in wondering whether it would connect to the baby boomers at all. I kind of had the sense, just from, public school, high school U.S. history classes, that all of the real action in the expansion of the judicial sphere took place in the 1960s, that it was a Warren Court phenomenon, which would mean, consequently, that there were no boomers involved in it, because there were no boomers on the Warren Court. They were from an older generation. But as I investigated in it, the phenomenon further, I found that the original generation, people like Warren and Justice Brennan, even though they were liberals who vastly expanded the reach of constitutional law, they still had some sense of the old Constitution. They had been educated in the old Constitution, and they had a sense of their own limits. They did not feel like the Constitution was nothing but their own personal plaything that they could make do whatever they want. It was the subsequent generations, the generations that Sonia Sotomayor represents, that completely lost any sense that they, the court was something bigger than them. They lost the phenomenon of humility. Humility was the virtue that they completely lacked in a way that the original generation, Warren and Brennan, did not. And so that's kind of where the real action is, I decided. The original generation had been pioneers, but it really took people like Sotomayor to completely break with any of the remnants of constitutional law as it had existed.
Well, let's talk about some of the other legacies of the baby boomer generation that are related to civil society in particular. There are a number that come up in your book. I'll just run through a couple of them with you and ask you to talk about them. One I hadn't thought about much and was an interesting direction you took. It's about drugs. Obviously, recreational drugs are part of the boomer legacy, but you really tie that to the boom in prescription drugs. No pun intended there with the boom in line. Didn't mean to do that. Can you talk about your argument there?
In addition to the mental exercise of imagining myself as a time traveler from 1947, I also did the opposite mental exercise that a lot of people do, which is to imagine yourself 200 years in the future and wonder, what is it about our society today that people will be aghast at in generations hence? That future generations will think of the way we think of things like slavery in the 19th century. And once you get past some of the usual suspects, things like abortion and factory farming, one of the ones that I truly believe future generations will be baffled by is the fact that, so many huge portions of the millennial generation are on mind-altering drugs. They think if the fact that every other person is taking medication for depression or anxiety just to get through their day, is that not an indication, first of all, that something might be wrong with your society, right? If people can't even get through the day without thinking of themselves as being chemically imbalanced and needing treatment. And as I traced back that phenomenon to see where it had come from and how we had gotten to a point where 25% of white women are on antidepressants in any given year, I found that it was, first of all, related to the boomer revolution in recreational drugs, that we would not ever have arrived at a place where taking psychiatric drugs was so normal and acceptable without first crossing the threshold of the boomers thinking that mind-altering recreational drugs like marijuana are totally fine and acceptable. That was something that they did that had not been the case in America at any previous time. America had never had like an opium tradition in the way that some Eastern societies do. So that was their doing. And then they were also the parents of the millennials and treated them in many ways like guinea pigs. They were the ones who were the first generation of parents to put their school-age kids on things like Ritalin. That was the baby boomers as well. And it's really disturbing to me to see so many people thinking of themselves as broken when really what all they are is humans, experiencing human emotions. And I think the boomers are responsible for that.
There's an argument that, and I think it's fairly well accepted at this point, that we are bowling alone now. Because not just because of this sort of skepticism towards institutions and individualism, but also in part because to lead what is regarded as a decent middle class life, you almost have to have both parents in the workforce now. And you make two arguments related, and that has negative ramifications on the rest of civil society, because aren't people with spare time on their hands to volunteer and to build those sorts of institutions and maintain those sorts of institutions, voluntary association. Two things you bring up related to this, it seems to me. One is the Betty Friedan, legacy, and you talk about, maybe you want to talk about here the survey that she may have misrepresented about suburban misery among housewives. And the second thing is sort of the capture and sort of destruction of the left by the baby boomers, which is an interesting argument. That there's the old sort of working class, pro-worker left is gone in many ways because of the boomers. Can you touch on those things?
Two very big topics.
Yeah.
So I'll touch on them briefly.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought up Betty Friedan. I watched the Phyllis Schlafly miniseries starring Cate Blanchett that came out on FX last year. And the best thing about that miniseries, which was not very good on the subject of Phyllis Schlafly, was Tracy Ullman playing Betty Friedan. And she really captured her repulsiveness, because Betty Friedan was just not a lot of fun to be around. But more than that, she was also someone who was dishonest. And that's my real problem with her. Not that she's some ultra-radical feminist, but that she lied. Right. The whole point of the feminine mystique is supposedly that members of Betty Friedan's class at Smith College had, as most women of their generation would, gotten married and moved to the suburbs and stopped working. Were not using their fancy Smith College degrees in the workplace. And there was an alumni questionnaire sent out just to see how her class of whatever year it was, 1930-something, was doing. And Betty Friedan claimed that all of these women, unbeknownst to each other, were going through the same mental crisis, the problem that has no name, that they were languishing away in the suburbs and feeling thwarted and miserable and oppressed. Actually, scholars have, since that book came out, gone back to the Smith College archives and found this alumni survey that Betty Friedan was supposedly basing her work on, and found that the housewives in it reported that they had never been happier in their lives. And more than that, that they all were asked, do you feel like your husband would let you work? Do you feel like you could find a job that used your degree if you wanted to? And they all said, yeah, absolutely. The reason I don't have one is because I choose not to. I would rather be home and give my time to things like philanthropy and volunteering and my kids' school and my church and whatnot. So that's, and we completely upended our society. Three quarters of families used to be single earner. Now it's almost completely reversed, with dual earner families now being the completely dominant model. That's a huge social revolution that, as you say, has decimated a lot of the, army of labor that used to populate American civil society. And we did it for what turns out to have been, from the very beginning, a lie. This concept that suburban life is miserable. So that's a huge problem, and I think the baby boomers are to blame for it. Well, what was your second question?
It goes into that. So the left, we at one point we. In this country, you might have had a more working class oriented left rather than an identity politics oriented left that would have resisted this and say, "Oh, making more people wage slaves is not social progress," or it would have been able to contend for higher wages more effectively than our left has, which isn't even all that interested in that question. At least it's down on the priority list. So maybe you can talk about that's something else you blame the boomers for, is for sort of suborning the left and making it the left. The left wing is so ironically the party of the elite and the rich
Absolutely.
in our society.
And it was a weird conclusion for me to arrive at in researching this book, because I had always assumed, like everybody else, that the boomers were the most progressive generation in history, that they were a left-wing generation. So it seems weird to say that one of their, a big item in their legacy would be the destruction of the left as a meaningful political force. But it's absolutely true. One of the things I looked for as an indication that a phenomenon was connected to the baby boomer generation was that it was transnational, because all of the countries of the Western democracies had baby boom generations. And so I figured that if something popped up, not just in the United States, but also in England and France and Germany and Australia and everywhere else, that might be a generational change and not just a particular product of specifically American circumstances. And the change you have described in the left wing and the social democratic parties of the Western democracies is a transnational phenomenon. It's something we see everywhere. The Labour Party in Britain, like the Democratic Party here, used to be the party of people without college degrees. If you worked with your hands, you voted Labour. And it's right there in the name, right? They're the party of people who belong to unions. They're the party of the laboring man. But over the course of the boomers' lifetimes, you've seen a reversal in that. And now, just as a matter of demography, the people who vote for the left-wing parties are more likely to have a college degree than the people who vote for the nominally right-wing or conservative parties. And that change has, naturally enough, gone along with a change in these left-wing parties' priorities. They no longer care that much about the problems facing working people. They care about boutique, niche identity politics type issues. And so that is, as you say, exactly one of the main reasons why you have not seen any attempt to find a political solution to what would otherwise be recognized as a massive problem that you used to be able to support a middle-class family on one income, and now you can't.
No, it's just remarkable. All right, one more thing before we pivot a little bit to philanthropy, because I want to ask you if you looked at all at sort of the boomer legacy in that area of our world. But one more myth I just want you to talk about, just for a couple of minutes, crime. You talk again about sort of dishonest conversation or discussion of crime and why our cities in the 60s and 70s were rendered uninhabitable. There's a story the boomers tell about that you point out is not exactly accurate.
Yeah, you see it a lot nowadays. People talk about over-incarceration and that America has never been safer. And so anybody who talks about law and order being a political problem is clearly just covering for racism or something. So we've lost the story that befell, violent crime in America in the 20th century which is that it massively spiked in the 1960s and 70s. There was just a lot more of it, and people moved their entire families, relocated their houses, gave up all of their investments in real estate to go to the suburbs because they were afraid of violent crime. And, I think there's room for debate in the discipline of criminology. And I'm okay with people having liberal or left-wing views within these debates on criminology. But I don't like people misrepresenting history. I don't like people lying. And so I think there's a real service in just going back and capturing the facts of what happened to American cities in the 60s and 70s. And the way that this connects to the baby boomer generation is something that only occurred to me as I was writing this book. It had never struck me before that the boomers might be one of the reasons why the story of violent crime and flight from the cities in the 60s and 70s is forgotten now. It's because they were too young to remember it, right? They fell, if you look at, the busing controversies that struck places like Boston in the 1970s, the baby boomers at that time were too old to be the actual students involved. So they were out of grade school and high school at the time, so they weren't paying attention to what was going on in Boston public schools as students, but not yet old enough to have kids of their own. So they were not the ones who were the parents wanting to flee out to the suburbs in order to save their kids from violent crime. They were in an in-between age at exactly the time that this violent crime issue was at its most acute. So because they weren't paying attention to it, they have forgotten about it. And because all of our politics and our sort of conventional cultural memory of 20th century history is shaped by what the boomers care about and remember, it's fallen off the landscape because they, in particular, as a generation, doesn't really loom large for them because they just weren't the right age to be affected by it.
So you just shoehorn it into the civil rights narrative and make it all neat and tidy that way rather than, tell the actual story, which I just bring up because if you have a concern for civil society and the flourishing of communities, ignoring the effect that high crime has on that is a huge mistake. And we need to relearn that lesson from the 60s and 70s, it seems to me.
Yeah, I noticed busing came up in one of the presidential debates funnily enough, between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden in the Democratic primary. She tried to hit him with having been, to bring in another thread, a transactional leader in Congress and cutting deals on the issue of busing. But after that attack landed on Joe Biden, she got her licks in and got a hit against him. People asked her, okay, well, Kamala Harris, do you want to bring back busing? What's your policy recommendation? Were you just making a rhetorical point, or do you actually have an agenda here that you want to change a policy in some school district in America? And it was very clear that she backed away instantly and said, no. I don't want to have a national busing policy. That would be a bad idea. So it exists only as a rhetorical penalty that you can inflict, but there is no sense of wanting to go back to that policy.
Well, let's touch on philanthropy here as we sort of wind up, Helen. Did you touch maybe here and there on that subject in the book, but not at any length? That's something else that's been transformed. Charity to philanthropy, actually, as sort of the preferred terminology we want to use for voluntary giving in the sector of society that we're talking about when we talk about this subject. What's the boomer legacy there?
This book that I've written is in some ways a companion volume to a book that came out exactly 1 year ago, 1 year before mine did, and that's Christopher Caldwell's The Age of Entitlement, which is also a look at America and what has happened to it since the 1960s. And my book was not exactly influenced by Caldwell's book because I had written most of my book before I got a galley of Caldwell's. But there's a point that he and I kind of converged on independently. And when I read it in his book, I knew I was on the right track and, identifying something real, which is a change in philanthropy. As Caldwell explains in his book, it used to be that if you ran a charity, your job would be alleviating poverty or making people's lives better. For example, if you ran a legal aid society, if you were a lawyer engaged in philanthropy, your job would be to defend people against landlords trying to kick them out, or, whatever petty little lawsuits that came up in the lives of poor people. Once the boomers came in, they decided, kind of in the same way that they decided transformational leadership was the only good kind and transactional leadership was bad, that penny ante stuff was not worth their time. That the only noble goal for a philanthropic institution was to change the law, which was why legal aid societies, to stick with that example, decided that they weren't going to go sue landlords anymore or collect people's debts or whatever. They were going to have landmark cases, and they were going to take it to the Supreme Court and get a precedent established. And that was the best use of their time as lawyers. And all of the day-to-day work of the old legal aid societies just fell by the wayside. And you see the same thing in charities and the NGO sector and nonprofits, this shift to focusing on changing the laws. And funnily enough, one of the points that Caldwell brings up is that there was some confusion in the initial years over whether those kinds of nonprofits should even be characterized as charities at all. Should you be able to make tax-deductible donations to organizations that are really basically doing something political? They're trying to change policy rather than doing the humble work of alleviating some kind of misery. So there were lots of legal changes that happened in order to bring about this new landscape that nowadays, before I looked into this issue, I just took as the natural order of things. Of course, federal employees should be able to make their deductible donations to political type NGOs. Of course, they're all the same kind of thing. When prior to the boomers, they would not have been considered the same kind of thing at all.
Once again, it comes back. It seems the scale of vision, like just sort of a raising of the gaze from the local to the national, the global, the landmark, as you say, versus the day to day. It seems we keep coming back to that in this conversation. One word for that is it's transformational. It's thinking in terms systemically, and another word would be sort of a vaulting arrogance or a vaunting arrogance, I guess I should say. This lack of humility,
which is. If this book has a running theme, that's it. It's arrogance. It's a lack of humility, because that's what the baby boomers are defined by.
All right, Helen, last question. I'll bring it back to your generation. We see some of that in the millennials, right? It's sort of there's also certainly a large gaze toward transformational sorts of projects or what they're interested in. So why, if the millennials have been so royally screwed by the boomers, why are they imitating them so much in their sort of in their moralism and that kind of their scale of their vision? Or am I wrong on that in proceeding on that premise?
You are correct that is what the millennials do, and there is no earthly reason why they should. And I wrote this book to get them to stop. It's totally true that the millennials are, even at their most rebellious, even the millennials who say, okay, boomer, and who think that their parents' generation wrecked the country, still give their lives to the causes that the boomers define as fashionable, still think that the boomers' politics in the 60s were the height of the American political tradition. They're still allowing the boomers to shape their own worldview and define their own concept of what's good and valuable and even cool, which is not traditionally something you allow your parents to define for you. So it's a strange pathology, and you never saw it more vividly than over the last summer when my generation tried to reenact its own 1968. So my hope is that by taking the boomers down a notch, I can wake the millennials from their boomer-obsessed slumber and make them knock it off.
A worthy goal. Helen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks you, Jeremy. That was a lot of fun.
The book is Boomers, The Men and Women Who Promised Freedom and Delivered Disaster. That's out from Sentinel. It's available A lot of places that aren't called Amazon. Buy it from something that's not Amazon, but buy the book. You will not regret it. And Helen, where can people find you online?
You can find me and a lot of other great writers at theamericanconservative.com. And I'm for my sins on social media, mostly on Twitter, at HER Andrews.
Very good. Thank you, Helen. Appreciate it.
That was a pleasure.